joining us now is one of my favorite political writers. John Nichols is the nation's national affairs correspondent. He's a contributing writer for The Progressive. He's associate editor of the Capital Times. He appears on TV all the time, MSNBC, NPR, BBC, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, he managed to co-author a new book with Robert McChesney entitled People Get Ready: The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy. John, as always, thanks for joining us.
I'm honored to be with you, my friend.
Oh, man, always a pleasure. So listen, and I love the topic of this book, and I love this book. I think it's fascinating. But first of all, let's start with the superficial, as I invariably do. Congratulations on naming a book after a Curtis Mayfield song. Well done.
Well, thank you, brother. And can I tell you, this has been one of the most interesting revelations of this book tour and doing all these interviews about it. And every show that I've been on has had a different version. Like a lot of shows, they play songs with music.
Uh-huh.
And so I have heard versions like rock versions, soul versions, gospel versions. It's actually quite cool.
Well, if you got to hear a song over and over and again, I'd pick that one. And since I started reading your book, I've been thinking about, well, what Curtis Mayfield title would I use? I'm thinking If There's a Hell Below, We're All Gonna Go is going to be the title of my book. But listen,
Perfect.
tell us a little bit. I mean, I've read it, but tell us a little bit about the book, if you would.
Absolutely. Look, this book is rooted in an experience that I've never had before. And I've written a lot about politics, a lot about media, a lot about economics over the years. But we had a phenomenon with the last books that Bob McChesney and I have written, which were mostly about media and democracy. They did well in the U.S. and they, got picked up at colleges, all the standard stuff. But in Europe, I started getting invited to come to conferences of businesses and CEOs and real players in economic affairs, because in Europe they're actually concerned about the decline of media, about the decline of journalism, for a whole bunch of good reasons, in ways that, frankly, a lot of American business is not. So here I was over in Europe. I'm giving talks and lectures and things. And, of course, I'd listen to what everybody else was talking about as well. What fascinated me was the central conversation among these CEOs, think tank heads, real tech geniuses, people that are on the cutting edge of all sorts of future technology, was about how many jobs are going to be destroyed by automation and by the digital revolution. And it wasn't that these people were happy about it or sad about it. It was just something that they absolutely knew. They were comfortable with that reality. And then about 2 years ago, Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, gave the keynote address at the great conference in Davos, where all the powerful people from economics around the world, some government folks, and he said, the next big issue, the great challenge that we're going to face is how many people are put out of work, how many industries are really radically altered by the automation of, not just these industries, but of society in general, and by the parallel digital revolution. And so I heard all this. I kept gathering all this information, Bob as well, and we were working on another book. And Bob and I decided we're just going to rip up what we're doing, because it strikes us that while everybody in power is talking about a jobless or at least a less job future, nobody in American politics and almost nobody in American media is talking about it. And we thought, boy, we better warn some folks about this, because it's coming at them very fast.
Right, and
the
just
title, People Get Ready.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I get it, and I think that I've been interested in this topic for a while myself. And it seems to me a couple things. One, and you address these in your book, but one is the idea that people will, and particularly decision makers, sometimes try to absolve themselves of responsibility for the jobs that have already been lost by blaming automation, when that is, in fact, not a factor in, for example, the job loss we've seen since 2008. But then on the flip side, others may use their reaction to that to kind of assume there's an ideological bent to any discussion of the impact of automation on jobs. And I think, while it's all prediction, and so there's a little bit of haziness to it, I think there's pretty compelling evidence that we're going to lose a lot of jobs in this process. Don't you?
Absolutely. Now, here's the way to think about it. First off, we've done a lousy job as regards jobs in the United States for a long time. We have allowed way too high unemployment. We've allowed way too high underemployment. The unemployment figures that we get aren't really an accurate measure of how many people are, looking for a job or looking for a job that could sustain their family. So right off the bat, we've got an economy that is shaky, that is vulnerable. Certainly for people of color, for young people, we have economic realities that are very daunting and very unsettling. But also for older workers, people in their 50s and 60s who maybe lost a lot of their economic strength in the crash of 2008 and its aftermath, still struggling to get by. And so we've got a vulnerability as regards jobs anywhere. On top of that, we have a terrible trade policy, which really does emphasize letting companies get into a race to the bottom, looking for the lowest paid workers around the world. That has harmed the U.S. a lot, so that's another fact. We know those things. Those are the realities we're well aware of. But now we have this new reality. The automation of industries is something that people have anticipated, for the better part of the century.
Right.
And in the 1960s, they were writing about it. We write in the book about how in the 60s, everybody was anticipating this. There were presidential commissions. And then it didn't come together quite as quickly as people thought it would. And so everybody kind of let their guard down. They're like, okay, we'll see a little automation, but it's never really going to be that big a factor. Well, here's what's happened. In the last 5 or 6 years, they really have caught up.
Mm-hmm.
And what we imagined possible is now becoming possible. And let me give you the simplest example. If you looked at Time magazine a week or so ago, the cover story was on the driverless car. I cannot emphasize to you, in doing the research on this book, every place we went, we encountered driverless cars. Driverless cars are on the roads already. There's all sorts of experimental projects going on in some areas around the country. There's a lot of them out there. They're remarkable. There's no question. They really do work. We've seen videos and storylines of people who are sight impaired being able to get into a driverless car, just say where they want to go, and they wheel right out onto the road safely, functionally. So the driverless car is a real reality. It's coming very, very fast. Put that in a box. Now let me move up another bit of information for you. In many American states, the number one job for men is driving. So let's put those two things together. Now, what do I mean by driving? I mean driving a cab, driving a bus, driving a truck, driving a forklift, driving a tractor. You start to add all these things together. If we're suddenly about to implement a automation change, a digital change, that is going to replace a lot of human drivers with a driverless car, what do we do with all those guys, mostly, not all, but who've been driving? This is the question of society that is forward-looking, that's doing any kind of industrial planning, any kind of social planning, should be deeply engaged in right now. And, my brother, I promise you, it isn't happening.
Right.
Our politics is not addressing this.
It's really interesting. We're talking with John Nichols, co-author of the new book, People Get Ready, The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy. I think a lot of people, as you mentioned, in the corporate world are looking at all this stuff, but I think that policymakers are not. I think there are ideological lines around it. I do remember when, the big debate decades ago was, what will workers do with all the leisure time when they only have to work 3 hours a day because of automation? Because at that point, productivity, increases in productivity and national wealth were being roughly shared between owners and or employers and employees. Now, of course, we've moved towards ever accelerating rates of inequality. So I think the question should be, in a sense, and I think that's one of the questions implicitly and explicitly posed by your book, I think the question should be, how do we address this? I mean, I think of it as an outsourcing in time rather than space.
Yeah.
And how do we address this in a way that is equitable and demand that it not make us more of, what they call a rentier economy, where the people with the money get the money? How do we distribute the fruits of this new technology in an equitable way? And frankly, there are economists like Tyler Cowen, there are commentators like Thomas Friedman who argue that it's going to be wonderful when 85% of the population is struggling to survive. What's the phrase? You have to be above average, like Lake Wobegon. All the kids have to be above average or they won't survive. But I don't see anybody. You guys are coming along now, and then there are utopian leftists talking about how we want to seize this technology so that nobody ever has to work again. But what's a kind of practical left response to the rise of this new automation?
Well, that's a fantastic and spot-on question. That's why I love talking to you about it. Here's the conundrum that we've got. This isn't going to all happen at once, right? It will happen in fits and starts. But what we do know is it's happening. And it's going to affect every policy debate, every political debate that we have. I would argue it's already impacting it.
Right.
I think the young people who are flocking to Bernie Sanders rallies fully understand what's coming. I think they grew up marinated in digital technologies. They see automation. They see digital change. They recognize we're in the midst of an absolute revolution as big as the Industrial Revolution. And so they're looking at alternatives that previously were thought of as off the table: democratic socialism, single-payer health care, all sorts of answers which are going to become very necessary as fewer and fewer people have real stable jobs. I also think people going to these Trump rallies, in the same way, some of these older guys going to the Trump rally who, lost a factory job, then they lost a warehouse job to automation. I think they understand awfully big, unsettling things are coming their way and they don't have much control over it. A moment like this is very dangerous for a society because when your political elites and when your media elites are not talking about the changes that are taking place, then you are going to see folks kind of go in lots of different directions looking for answers. They might end up with a Bernie Sanders, who frankly I think has a very humane, very responsible set of answers. He doesn't always talk about these issues as much as I'd like him to, but at least he offers some vision there. But they could also some folks could end up with a Trump.
Right.
And so what I would say is it becomes incumbent upon the left, on progressive thinkers, to get a very rational take on this. And the rational take, in my view, is to reject tech utopianism. Do not imagine that there's going to be an app or some sort of technological fix that's going to get us out of this. Some things need a political answer. By the same token, accept some of the visionary talk about technology from 50, even 100 years ago. It is true. We have technologies coming online that are going to really allow a lot of us to avoid drudgery. We will not have to do some of the most unpleasant jobs that people do. And that's okay. That's a good thing to have, people have an opportunity to work less in more rewarding work for better compensation. That ought to be our goal.
Right.
And we can get there. We really can. But to get there, we have to break one of the worst patterns of the current moment. And that is, as people are pushed out of their jobs, as they're downsized, as they're offshored, outsourced, all the different things that happen to them. And as this automation revolution comes on, what so many of us do is try to cobble together a life out of what remains of economic opportunity. That means we take our personal car and we start trolling the streets of the city trying to find people that'll pay us to give them a ride.
Right.
We take a room in our apartment and we start renting it out on Airbnb. We, take little tiny consulting jobs. We try to piece together all of these things in hopes that somehow we can work hard enough from before dawn till after nightfall to keep above some line in the middle class, right?
Right.
That calculus, if all of us are doing that, right, it's going to get harder and harder and harder. And so we have to understand this is already happening, but we're not talking about it much. We're not talking about, A, whether that's the right response. I would say it is, and I would say it's just a way to keep redistributing a lot of wealth upwards. And two, if it is what we're going to have to go through for a while, if that's the transition period, then we had better get single-payer health care, free transportation, and a host of other changes very, very quickly so that those of us who are cobbling together an existence out of all these pieces don't spend everything we've got just to get to our next job, or don't really teeter on the balance if we just get a little bit sick of not being able in any realistic way to survive.
Yeah, I think you put that beautifully, John Nichols, and I think that is a challenge. We've got to kind of navigate the straits of the next few years, and we've got to, I think what you're also saying is we've got to solve this problem collectively, not through individual solo struggle. And not only do we have a risk from the far-right ideologues, but I think from the intellectual veneer that's being given to this upward distribution of wealth by some of the economists and Thomas Friedman's out there who are trying to say, well, this is the way the world should inevitably work. So thanks for writing this book. Thanks for presenting an alternative to that dystopian vision they're trying to sell to us as utopia. And John Nichols, co-author of People Get Ready, thanks for coming on the show.
I've enjoyed this conversation greatly. I can't think of a better place to talk about this book.
Well, I can't think of a better guest to talk about this subject with. So, John Nichols, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you.